We are back on MorningLine. Thanks for joining us. Our guest is Tiffany Ruby Patterson. She's an associate professor of African American Studies at Vanderbilt. It's a pleasure to have her on this morning, talking about Juneteenth and the history of it. We kind of touched on it a bit and how it played out. And as we went to the break, you kind of made the observation that with Juneteenth maybe being the flashpoint to some degree, a lot of people obviously observing it as a federal holiday today, but there's pushback. That's what you observe. And how do you see that?
The pushback to Juneteenth?
Mm-hmm. And yeah, what it stands for.
Yes, it's going to be hard for a lot of Americans, particularly white Americans, to embrace Juneteenth because it brings the question of slavery front and center. What is Juneteenth about? How do you explain it to your children? Okay, because we're in a moment now of a resurgence of white supremacist thinking, battling over what's taught in textbooks at schools, which is fascinating to me because they didn't teach it in schools, okay? At all black school perhaps, but even there, slavery is a painful topic for many African Americans. And so I didn't learn anything about African American history in my school. In my grade school, which was a Catholic school, which my mother put us in when she could saved up, took jobs to save up the money, because the black school in Gary, the neighborhood I grew up in, was very crowded. And they would give the new books to the white schools and give the used books to the black school, which meant we couldn't take books home. And my mother said, absolutely not. We've got to find a way to bring books home. Okay. So little things like that reminded one that this was a different society for African Americans. Even if you are privileged to go to college and raise your children up north, which was seen as better than segregated South, and so on. So for African Americans, living with the residue of slavery in my lifetime was always there. I didn't know what it was. I had to go to college to find out what it was. But certainly my parents, I now know, gave us plenty of signals, because we would go south every summer. And now I tell my students, my father would get to Paducah, Kentucky. He'd get there and we would have to cross the Mississippi River there. And I remember Daddy would always say, and the car would be loaded with my mom, his sister, her sister, and their children. And I was the oldest, and he would say, straighten up back there, we're crossing over. And I never understood what he was talking about. I had to get to be a college student to realize he was referencing segregation. Yeah,
and you said you moved north, but you went south every summer still.
Every summer.
Your parents wanted you to have that connection still.
Oh, without a doubt.
Despite the fact that you had to straighten up when you crossed through Paducah.
Yeah, and they never explained what they meant. I learned it. I figured it out. But it was, once you crossed over from Paducah, Kentucky, you were back in Mississippi. And this is where they kill people if you make a wrong move. And so while my mom did not want me to grow up there and didn't want the schools, she wanted the culture. She wanted grandparents. She wanted the cooking. She wanted the kids. Oh, we absolutely loved it. It was paradise for us kids. Chickens and horses and cows. Cousins who you played with. I learned to ride a horse there. Okay, my Uncle Gordon loved horses. So it's a mixed world. It's a world that black folks created. If they had land, as my grandfathers did, they were not in as much danger as if you had to be a sharecropper. Okay, so we had that privilege, and I've learned that it was a privilege. It wasn't true for everyone. I have that memory, but then I'm a historian, so I know that it could be a dangerous place with the wrong move. My father told me a story once on the trip down. My mother would be considered a radical today. They stopped at a restaurant to get some food, and They went into the restaurant. We all went into the restaurant, and she expected to sit down at the counter and eat her food. They brought the food in bags and told them they couldn't eat it there. My mother was furious, and they had not paid for it yet. She said, she looked at the woman and said, well, I won't eat it anywhere. And she turned around and walked out of the restaurant. My father told me years later, he said, I was nervous. I said, why? He said, she had insulted the white woman. So little things like that, I'm collecting stories now, family stories like that, of slights and what it could mean if someone took offense in the South. So I can understand why Juneteenth is an irritant to some people in the South, because it brings the history up front and center one day for a holiday to celebrate that slaves were free. I'm sure there are people who don't want to celebrate it, don't want their kids to know about it, etc. You know?
Which I simply don't understand that, but we'll talk more. Let's take a phone call. Someone's waiting through there. Ed, good morning. Hi, Ed.
Hey, hello.
Hey.
Look, I'm 75 years old. I just want to get some stuff straight. Now, I think we all know who this person is, but he dressed up in a Confederate Army uniform to celebrate Old South days when he was a student at Auburn University. Who said that neo-Nazis and the Ku Klux Klan were fine people? And did Tennessee really succeed from the Union and fight to preserve slavery? Thank you.
I believe they did.
Yeah.
I'm not a specialist on Tennessee, but I like him. We are. It is fascinating as a historian for me, and I'm a historian of the United States and the diaspora as well. The spread of slaves throughout the world. But it's fascinating to me that we haven't resolved our discomfort with our history. We want to flatten it out. We want to make it something that it's not, and we still are doing that. And the gentleman he referred to wants to bring back the old ways.
Right.
But there, you know, what is interesting also is that there are a lot of white people that don't agree with that. We know that some do, but not all white people agree with that. Things have changed. History keeps moving. It doesn't stay in the same place.
You know, I'm trying to think locally here. For instance, you were probably familiar with the Confederate statue in Nathan Bedford Forest.
Yes.
I'm not talking about the bust at the Capitol, but on I-65.
Yes, I see it a lot.
Which has since come down.
Yeah.
It has since come down. But, and that was, you know, private property and how it came down after the owner died. But there are folks there still today say, well, that's history. Why take down the history? And then there's the whole issue of it's offensive to many people and all of that. But it's almost as though, you know, you want, certainly the Confederate flag and seeing it there, and Nathan Bedford Forest is all part of history, but so too is slavery. You can't pick and choose what part of history you want to remember.
Yes, I think that those who make that argument would like for that history to disappear.
Of the slavery part.
Of the slavery part.
Of it. Because then they're talking about the Confederate flag. Well, it's not really about slavery. It's more about Southern heritage and all this. And yet for a lot of people, they say Southern heritage is slavery.
It's what I was about to say.
Okay.
We have to acknowledge that Southern heritage is soaked in slavery. There's no way to get around it. Now, does it mean that every single person is flawed? No, it does not. It was the South was a complicated place. There were people, white people, who opposed slavery in the South as well, and fought against it. There is this is something I didn't know. I don't profess to know everything, but there was a county in Mississippi, Jones County, that where the people who lived there went to war with the Confederacy because many of those white men had black wives and children. And they fought with the Union. That's a fascinating story that I learned late, actually. So American history is very complex, and it is history, but history, the residue of history is always in the present. And sometimes you don't see it but it's always there. Whether it's, I had a colleague in New York, I came here from SUNY Binghamton in New York, and I have a colleague there who's German and was working, his work was on the aftermath of Nazi Germany. And of course, they're grappling with similar issues. What do we continue to show from that period, that horrible period where so many Jews were murdered? And what do we put in a museum? And of course, he would never argue for erasing that history. You teach it, but you put it in a museum. You don't display a swastika on the street.
You don't have a statue of Hitler.
Right. You put him in a museum.
Right.
Because you don't want to forget him, but you don't want to lionize those people either. Those statues, like a forest, belongs in a museum. I would never say destroy it. Because if you destroy it, you lose the memory. Right. And so the memory is important, and the progress is important. And it's interesting teaching at this moment. I've been teaching a long time, and so I can map what my students would be saying, 30, 40 years ago, as opposed to what they're saying now. And of course, it has a lot to do with school I'm in. I'm at Vanderbilt. My students, for the most part, are either shocked because they came out of good backgrounds, and many of them are wealthy. And when they learn about slavery, there's an interesting reaction to that. In one class a few years ago, 2 or 3 years ago, I assigned a novel by Marlon James called Book of Night Women. It's set on a plantation in Jamaica. This is the diaspora part, and it's about what happened to women. And one of my white students, they read it over Thanksgiving break, and she found my personal phone number and called me. And she wasn't angry with me, she was angry with her school. She said, I never heard this. Why didn't somebody tell me about this? And I get that reaction far more than
so you're saying even your students now at Vanderbilt are all of a sudden shocked by some of what they're learning from you in your African American Studies class, because they didn't have any of that in high school?
They didn't have any. She kept saying, I went to a wealthy school. I went to a private school. No one mentioned this to me. She was just furious. Equally so, one of my black students, when we got back from Thanksgiving break, they had all read the novel. And one of my black students who just graduated with his law degree from Tulane, he was so upset because he was very popular. He's on campus, etc. He says, I never want to talk to a white person ever again in life. And I said, you're going to Tulane. I think you're going to talk to some white people. And so he's equally as shocked. Yeah. Okay, because he didn't know.
Same thing. So the white and black. Listen, we'll take a break on that note, and we'll come back. We'll pick up on the conversation right where we are on that. We can take more phone calls as we're talking Juneteenth and issues around that with our good guest right after this. Stay with us.
This is a Storm 5 weather update. For weather on the go, download the Storm Shield app.
I'm News Channel 5 weekday morning meteorologist